Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we sift through layers of documentation, research papers, and military briefs to bring you the essential knowledge you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we are undertaking a really critical deep dive. We're looking at how global great powers organize themselves to fight in what is, well, arguably the most dynamic and contested domain there is, information warfare. And we have a fascinating stack of source material here. It's essentially a high-level comparative military brief, and it lays out two fundamentally different organizational blueprints. So our mission today is to really unpack this divergence, because on one side you have these highly centralized, unified information command structures. China's People's Liberation Army is the key example here. And on the other side, we have the more fragmented, federated, and frankly legally constrained structures of the U.S. and its key allies. And this isn't just a difference in org charts, it's a strategic choice. It's built right into the DNA of the political system itself.
And that's absolutely the most critical insight for you to walk away with, that organizational divergence. For decades, things like information technology, cyber, psychological operations, they were all seen as supporting capabilities.
Just background functions.
Exactly. Sophisticated background functions.
Yeah.
But now they are decisive. They are the primary warfighting domain. And what determines success in this new domain is, well, it's the speed and the coherence with which a nation can act. When we look at the source material, a clear pattern just jumps out. You see authoritarian structures prioritizing unity of command, prioritizing speed, eliminating all that internal friction.
Right.
Then you have democratic structures, and they prioritize oversight, legal checks, accountability. Which, it necessarily introduces friction, it introduces slowness. And that fundamental trade-off is the operational tension we're really going to explore today.
So let's put that tension in immediate focus for you. We were talking about the stark contrast between, say, the PLA's Unified Strategic Support Force, the SSF. It's a single, centralized information punch. It rolls up space, cyber, and electronic warfare directly under the top national leadership.
One command.
Versus the fragmented U.S. approach, where the exact same operation would require coordinating across separate commands, different agencies, and crucially, a legal minefield we're going to get into called the Title 10 versus Title 50 divide. That difference in organizational gravity. Yeah, that's everything. Hashtag tech IMO. The emergence of information as a war-fighting domain. Okay, let's unpack this and start with the history, right? The evolution of information warfare itself. If you look back at military doctrine, maybe in the 1990s, you see this term information operations, or IO.
Right, IO.
And it was purely tactical.
Yeah.
It was designed to support kinetic action.
Yeah.
Maybe jamming an enemy radar or slipping some intel past an adversary's firewall to help a ground unit. What was the moment? What fundamentally changed the strategic calculus that elevated this from just a support role to a primary domain of warfare?
The shift was, it was revolutionary. And the source material frames it perfectly. It says we moved from thinking about support to obsessing over superiority. IO was narrow, modern IW, information warfare, is total. And the strategic shock moment, the event that really rewrote the playbook for NATO and the U.S., was Russia's aggressive and non-kinetic campaign in 2014, specifically in Crimea and eastern Ukraine.
2014, okay.
Yeah. Russia demonstrated something that Western militaries had really only hypothesized about. It was the power of seamlessly integrating information effects across both the technical and the cognitive spheres to achieve strategic goals without relying on large-scale kinetic force.
So they weren't just blowing things up.
Not at all. They combined limited military action with deep fake news campaigns, targeted cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, and really comprehensive electronic warfare to disrupt Ukrainian command and control. The goal wasn't just to win a single battle. It was to dissolve the opponent's will to fight and, at the same time, to control the international narrative simultaneously.
So the big realization was that you could actually achieve annexation or regime change or destabilization by operating completely below the threshold of what we normally call armed conflict. And that makes all the traditional responses, well, obsolete.
Exactly. It completely sidesteps them. And that realization forced the U.S. military to fundamentally reconceptualize the entire operating environment. And you see this reflected in their joint doctrine now. Specifically in Joint Publication 304, it now defines the information environment across three critical interrelated dimensions. This is, it's the intellectual foundation for how all modern information warfare is planned and executed today.
Okay, so let's break down those three dimensions for our listener.
The first dimension is the physical. This is the tangible material infrastructure. You should think of the actual networks themselves. The fiber optic cables, the routers, the physical servers, the command posts, the communication satellites. It's the hardware. It's what a traditional missile or a highly focused cyber attack designed to shut down a system actually targets.
So to make it concrete, if a power plant is shut down by malware, the physical dimension is the actual circuit breaker or the control system that was corrupted.
Precisely. That's a perfect example. The second dimension is the informational. Now, this is less about the physical hardware and more about the content. The data, the signals, the flow of information itself involve how data is collected, processed, stored, and protected. This is the domain of, say, signal integrity, intelligence analysis, and data manipulation.
Okay, so sticking with the power plant example, if the physical target was the circuit breaker, the informational target might be manipulating the sensor data so the operators think the plant is running normally, even as it's, I don't know, overheating.
A fantastic illustration, you've got it. And that leads directly to the third, and honestly the most complex to command, which is the cognitive dimension. This is where that informational flow meets human perception. It's the minds of the decision makers, the warfighters, and the target audiences. This is where information, whether it's truthful or manipulated, influences beliefs, shapes perceptions, and ultimately affects strategic choices and the will to fight.
It's the human element.
It is the human element. So if you successfully manipulate the sensor data, that's the informational dimension, and that causes the plant manager to miscalculate and decide to shut down power to an entire city, that's a cognitive effect. You have successfully wielded information as a weapon in the cognitive dimension, and any successful IW campaign has to address all three of these dimensions.
That structural framework is really clear. So the ultimate goal then, according to the sources we're looking at, is to achieve what they call information advantage. Now, you can't really achieve permanent superiority here, so what does the U.S. military actually mean by information advantage?
The official definition is quite encompassing. It describes it as the operational benefit derived from the ability to collect, control, exploit, and defend information and information systems. I mean, at its core, it's the constant state of having better access, better integrity, and better command of the information environment than your opponent does, while you're simultaneously undermining theirs.
But it's not a one-and-done thing.
No, and that's the crucial point the sources stress. This has to be a continuous effort. Unlike, say, achieving air superiority, where you might sweep the skies and then declare the domain secure for a period of time, information domain superiority is fleeting. It's momentary. Your adversaries are operating continuously, which means you have to operate continuously.
Which brings us directly to a key doctrinal concept that comes up again and again in these papers, persistent engagement. This was introduced in the 2018 DoD cyber strategy. So what does that continuous operating model entail, practically speaking?
Persistent engagement is a huge shift in thinking. It recognizes that competition in the information environment is a 24/7 reality. It doesn't matter if we're in peacetime or wartime. It requires a proactive, forward-leaning posture.
So not just sitting back and waiting.
Exactly. Instead of simply waiting for an attack to hit our own networks, which is a purely defensive stance, persistent engagement means operating in adversary networks below the threshold of conflict to understand their capabilities, disrupt their planning, and impose costs on them before their operations can ever reach us. This is the real essence of the defend forward approach. It acknowledges that the boundary of the information domain isn't our own border, it's wherever our interests are being contested. It's a doctrinal commitment to continuous, proactive operational activity.
And can you briefly connect this to the bigger picture, the overarching military strategy, the U.S. Army's multi-domain operations, or MDO?
Of course. MDO is the recognition that future conflicts, they have to be won by simultaneously integrating effects across all domains: land, sea, air, space, and now cyber and the electromagnetic spectrum. Information is absolutely critical here, but it has this dual function.
Okay.
On one hand, it's the essential enabler. It provides the intelligence and the command and control, the C2 that links the entire kinetic fight together. But on the other hand, it's also a weapon in its own right used to achieve those standalone cognitive effects we just talked about, winning the war of perception and decision-making. And this is where the problem starts. Trying to organize all these disparate military and intelligence organizations to command this dual-use weapon. That's where the Western model immediately encounters enormous challenges. Hashtag tag 2, command and control, C2 challenges in the Western context.
So let's pivot directly to that organizational difficulty. You need to integrate the physical, informational, and cognitive dimensions, and you have to do it in real time. But the source material highlights that in the U.S. system and in allied systems, this requires coordinating organizations that often have, well, fundamentally different cultures, different histories, and most importantly, different legal authorities. So how does that friction manifest in the real world?
It manifests as slowness. It's as simple as that. I mean, imagine a scenario. A cyber organization identifies a critical network vulnerability that's being exploited by an adversary. That's the physical and informational dimensions.
Okay, they found the breach.
Right. Now, they need to coordinate with an intelligence unit to confirm the adversary's intent and who their target audience is. That's informational and cognitive. Then, they need a psychological operations unit to craft a narrative to counter the adversary's influence campaign, which is purely the cognitive dimension. Those three steps, which should ideally take minutes, maybe hours, they involve three separate organizations, maybe reporting to completely different chains of command, and each one requires its own internal review and approval process. It's a bureaucratic nightmare.
And this rapid operational requirement is in direct conflict with what the sources call the temporal compression challenge. I really like that phrase because it captures the impossible speed of modern information warfare.
Temporal compression is the reality. It's the fact that effects in this domain happen nearly instantaneously. A cyber intrusion happens in milliseconds. A disinformation campaign can be launched, spread virally across the globe, and affect public opinion in the time it takes for a government committee to even convene.
Right, before the meeting is even on the calendar.
Yeah, exactly. Traditional military C2 processes, they were built for a slower industrial age conflict model. They rely on these sequential, deliberative planning cycles that measure time in days or even weeks. When those slow processes encounter the viral speed of the information domain, the result is a massive vulnerability. We call it strategic latency.
Strategic latency.
It's the critical delay between identifying an operational requirement, say an adversary launching a highly damaging influence campaign, and actually delivering a coordinated, integrated information effect in response. While the Western side is waiting on the lawyers to sign off, the adversary has already achieved its strategic objective. This latency forces us to continuously seed the operational initiative. We're always playing catch-up.
This brings us right to the structural root of the problem, and it's something the sources spend a significant amount of time on because it's literally baked into U.S. law, the legal divide between Title 10 and Title 50. Let's spend a moment on this because it sounds like it's the engine of that strategic latency.
It absolutely is. This legal split is the organizational fault line, Title 10 of the U.S. Code that governs military operations. The armed forces, their training, their organization, their use in warfighting. Title 50, on the other hand, governs intelligence activities, covert actions, foreign intelligence collection, analysis. Historically, these were very distinct worlds. Soldiers fight, spies gather secrets.
They're not anymore.
In the information domain, that line is utterly destroyed. It's completely blurred. The exact same physical or informational action can fall under either Title 10 or Title 50, depending purely on the intent of the action and its ultimate effect. This confusion is institutionalized friction.
Can you give us a concrete scenario just to illustrate how that bureaucratic nightmare plays out in a hypothetical information operation?
Of course. Imagine a military unit wants to penetrate a foreign military's satellite communication network.
Okay.
Scenario A. If the intent is purely to collect intelligence, to listen in on their tactical movements and report that information back to the CIA or the NSA, that is a Title 50 intelligence activity. It requires very specific oversight and high-level approval from intelligence oversight committees in Congress.
Okay, that's the spy stuff.
Right. Now, scenario B. The unit uses the exact same technique, the same code, to penetrate the same network. But now their intent is to inject data that disrupts the adversary's navigational systems, maybe causing a critical logistics supply ship to turn around and go home. That is now a Title 10 military operation. It requires policy review by the Department of Defense and notifying completely different congressional committees, like the Armed Services Committees.
So the action is identical, but the intent changes everything.
It changes everything legally. And what if the unit tries to do both? Collect intelligence and disrupt logistics? Well, it immediately becomes a complicated hybrid operation. And this is where the legal review process just grinds to a halt. Planners have to coordinate lawyers from the DoD and the intelligence community. They'll often force the operation to be split into two separate sequential actions. One Title 50, one Title 10, slowing everything down, potentially by weeks or even more.
And it gets even more complicated when the operation risks being defined as a covert action, doesn't it?
Precisely. If an information operation is deemed a covert action, which is often defined as an activity designed to influence political, economic, or military conditions abroad, and it's conducted in a way that avoids attribution to the U.S., it requires a presidential finding,
So it goes all the way to the top.
all the way to the White House. That high-level requirement for executive sign-off and mandatory congressional notifications, sometimes within 48 hours, is just a non-starter when you're dealing with a fast-moving viral campaign. The system is structurally designed to impose checks and balances, and the time required for those checks is the fuel for strategic latency.
So the core takeaway here for the Western model is that the structure is fundamentally designed to prioritize legal oversight and democratic accountability over raw operational speed. It's the necessary but very costly price of being a democracy in the age of viral warfare.
It is. The fragmentation and this Title 1050 divide, they guarantee that military action adheres to legal norms, civilian control, and specialized expertise. But this organizational friction creates gaps in coverage and complicates integration to an extreme degree, leading to Western militaries constantly advocating for faster policy review mechanisms, but never truly solving the underlying legal tension that is locked right into the U.S. code.
Okay, so if complexity and legal friction are the defining features of the Western approach, the Strategic Support Force, or SSF, is the mirror image. It's as if China looked at all those seams, all those gaps, and said, we will eliminate them. This is where it gets really interesting. So tell us about the SSS. It was established during the big PLA reforms in 2015-2016. How does this structure enforce that unity of command, and what's the strategic philosophy behind it?
The creation of the SSF was probably the most profound organizational restructuring in the PLA in decades. It consolidated all these dispersed information and strategic capabilities, specifically space, cyber, and electronic warfare, into a single, unified, high-end force. And crucially, the sources emphasize that the SSF reports directly to the Central Military Commission, the CMC. That's the absolute apex of China's military and political leadership. It's Xi Jinping and the top generals.
And it bypasses the regional commands.
It completely bypasses the regional theater commands, and that's incredibly important. It means that strategic direction and control of these critical high-demand assets remains centralized at the national level. The SSF is designed to be the CMC's powerful, unified instrument for rapid, nationwide information campaign execution. There are no inter-service turf wars to worry about, and there is certainly no Title 10, Title 50 divide to navigate. Political unity translates directly into operational unity of command.
It sounds less like a typical military command and more like the ultimate operational CEO for all of China's non-kinetic warfare efforts.
That is a very accurate analogy, and you can see this commitment to integration in the SSF's internal structure. It's divided into two primary operational departments. The first is the Network Systems Department. This department is the nerve center for all offensive and defensive cyberspace operations, electronic warfare, or EW, and even some psychological operations elements. Now, just putting cyber and EW under one roof is a massive organizational advantage.
Because in the West, they're often separate.
Sure. Exactly. In many Western systems, these two are separate. Cyber targets the digital domain. EW targets the electromagnetic spectrum. But the reality is that the most powerful information effects happen when you seamlessly integrate them. The SSF is built from the ground up to achieve this integrated effect automatically.
And the second department covers the critical high ground of space.
Yes, the Space Systems Department. This includes responsibility for space-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance ISR, as well as satellite communications and navigation support like their Beidou system, which is their version of GPS. I mean, information warfare is incredibly data-intensive. It relies entirely on high-fidelity, high-speed data delivery. By having the operators of the networks, the Network Systems Department, and the operators of the pipeline that feeds them the data, the Space Systems Department, all reporting to the same SSF commander, they ensure that space support is seamlessly integrated into every single information campaign from the moment a signal leaves Earth until it reaches the targeted network.
So they have organizationally eliminated the very seams that the U.S. is forced to coordinate across. The strategic goal here is crystal clear. Provide the top leadership with a high-speed, centralized instrument for synchronized information effects.
And this centralized structure flows directly from their doctrine. It's not just an org chart. The PLA's core doctrinal belief is that information dominance is the indispensable prerequisite for victory. They see information superiority as creating the operational conditions that make a kinetic victory either inexpensive or ideally even unnecessary.
Let's delve into the doctrinal concepts that enable this. The first one is called systems confrontation and systems destruction warfare. That sounds intense.
It is a holistic, operational view of conflict. It posits that modern warfare is fundamentally a confrontation between entire operational systems, their system of intelligence, C2, and logistics, versus our system. Therefore, the goal of systems destruction warfare isn't just to target individual ships or planes, but to paralyze the adversary's entire system of systems.
Break it down so it can't function.
Exactly, and the SSS is the key tool for this. Its mission is to target the opponent across those three dimensions we identified, the cognitive, the cyber, and the electromagnetic spectrum, to blind, confuse, and disconnect the enemy command structure. I mean, if the enemy cannot communicate, cannot see the battle space, and cannot trust their own data, then the amount of physical destruction required to achieve victory becomes minimal. It's about achieving operational paralysis through information control.
And alongside that very technical systems approach, they employ the famous non-kinetic toolkit known as the three warfares. And this operates continuously in peacetime and wartime, and is heavily focused on that cognitive domain.
Right. The three warfares are the unified psychological, narrative, and legal assault that accompanies the technical system's destruction. And they are insidious because they're always running. They're targeting both foreign audiences and often the populations of nations competing with China. The first is psychological warfare. This is designed to undermine the adversary's will to fight and the morale and credibility of their leadership. It uses targeted disinformation and influence operations aimed directly at operational forces or key decision-makers to encourage defections, miscalculation, or internal discord.
And the second is public opinion warfare. This sounds more like shaping the narrative on the international stage.
That's precisely what it is. It involves proactively building support for China's actions, say, claiming disputed territory in the South China Sea, and simultaneously eroding international and domestic support for its adversaries. This happens among neutral nations, among allies, and even within the adversary's own civil society. It effectively weaponizes the global media landscape.
And the third, and this one is maybe the least understood in the West, is legal warfare or lawfare.
Yes, lawfare. This involves using international law, domestic law, and legal claims to constrain the adversary's actions and to justify China's own. For example, constantly defining aggressive patrols as legitimate maritime defense operations, or using international legal forums to cast doubt on the territorial claims of rivals. It's about establishing the legal high ground before conflict even begins.
So what we're looking at is an integrated three-pronged cognitive attack coordinated by a unified command in the SSF, designed to change perception and behavior long before any kinetic conflict is even required. It's a structure built for rapid, sustained competition in that gray zone. So if the SSF is the model of unity, the U.S. system is defined by institutional separation and stovepipes. Let's start with U.S. Cybercom, which is a centerpiece of U.S. military cyber efforts. It was elevated back in 2018 to a unified combatant command. So what are its core missions and where do its limitations really begin?
U.S. Cybercom is absolutely responsible for directing and synchronizing military operations in cyberspace. Its missions are vital. Defend forward those proactive operations in adversary networks to disrupt, attacks, protect, which is ensuring the security of the DoD's own vast networks, and support, providing cyber effects to support the geographic combatant commanders in Europe or the Pacific. It has certainly brought more structure and expertise to military cyber operations. But the moment U.S. Cybercom was created, the organizational friction was institutionalized right from the start via the highly controversial dual hat arrangement.
And that's the arrangement where the commander of U.S. Cybercom is also at the same time the director of the National Security Agency, the NSA. So what was the rationale for that? And why does this arrangement become such a lightning rod for that Title 10, Title 50 tension we talked about?
The rationale was purely technical and operational expediency. It was a shortcut. The military cyber forces required the NSA's massive technical infrastructure, its unparalleled signals intelligence collection capabilities, and its deep, deep reservoir of technical expertise to operate effectively. So by having one person wear both hats, the military side, the Title 10 side, gains immediate access to the intelligence side's resources, the Title 50 side.
But it creates a conflict of interest.
It institutionalizes the conflict that one commander is forced to constantly balance competing masters. Should I prioritize a military operation under Title 10 that might compromise a long-term, high-value intelligence collection effort under Title 50? Should I share a critical intelligence asset with a military unit if that risks revealing the source to a wider operational community? The dual hat forces a single individual to navigate a legal and policy terrain that is, by its very nature, designed to keep those two missions separate. This inherent duality adds bureaucratic drag to every single high-level decision.
And even if that commander manages to perfectly balance both of those roles, U.S. Cybercom's authority is still limited mainly to cyberspace. The full spectrum of information warfare remains fragmented across the rest of the U.S. defense enterprise.
And that is a core vulnerability compared to China's SSF. If the SSF is a streamlined, single factory, the U.S. system is a collection of hyper-specialized workshops that barely talk to each other. We have numerous organizational stovepipes that prevent the kind of unified information campaign you need to compete with China's integrated model.
Okay, so let's get into the weeds. Break down that fragmentation for us.
Let's start with Military Information Support Operations, or MISO. This is formerly PSYOPs. It handles influence activities, propaganda, messaging, and it resides primarily under U.S. Special Operations Command, USOCOM. So if U.S. Cybercom penetrates a network, it then has to stop, draft a formal request, and coordinate with a completely separate combatant command, USOCOM, to layer in a cognitive effect like a propaganda message or a targeted information release. The planning culture, the funding lines, the approval processes are entirely different.
And electronic warfare, which the SSF sees as intrinsically linked to cyber, is still held separately in the U.S. system.
That's right. Electronic warfare, or EW capabilities, the ability to jam, blind, and disrupt communications and radar through the electromagnetic spectrum, are primarily retained by the individual military services, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. While the services may integrate their own capabilities, a joint operational commander like the head of U.S. Cybercom has to coordinate with the services to employ those EW assets. This means negotiating for resources and deconflicting operations rather than simply commanding them directly as the SSF commander does.
Another layer of bureaucracy.
Another layer. And then you have to consider space-based capabilities. The satellites that provide the ISR, the targeting, the communication links, the essential backbone of all modern warfare, are controlled by U.S. Space Command and the Space Force. Again, while cooperation is mandated, it is not unified command. If the SSF has the network and space departments in one house, the U.S. has to knock on the neighbor's door every single time it needs satellite support for a cyber operation. And finally, we have to mention strategic communications and public affairs. These are strictly separated, mandated by law, to protect civil liberties and to ensure that the government provides only truthful information and absolutely never targets domestic audiences. And while that's necessary for a democracy, this separation means the U.S. military cannot run the aggressive, proactive narrative campaigns, the public opinion warfare, that its adversaries conduct so seamlessly.
So for the listener, what is the cumulative operational consequence of all this organizational separation? What does it all add up to?
The cumulative effect is strategic latency, amplified. It makes it so much worse. Planning an integrated information campaign becomes an exercise in bureaucratic coordination. It requires knitting together U.S. Cybercom, U.S. OCOM, U.S. Space Command, multiple service components for EW, and multiple intelligence agencies, all while you're simultaneously navigating the legal clearance process that demands all these checks and balances. The complexity is exponential, and it leads to delays that simply concede the initiative to adversaries who are built for speed. It's like a committee meeting trying to outrun a wildfire.
Okay, given those inherent structural limitations in the U.S. system, that Title 1050 problem and all the stovepipes, let's look at how key U.S. allies are innovating, because they're essentially trying to find a compromise, right? How do we achieve the operational integration we need without sacrificing the democratic norms that define us?
These allied models are absolutely crucial to look at because they represent pragmatic, real-world attempts to solve the fundamental friction points that plague the U.S. system. They are models of necessary adaptation. We can start with the United Kingdom and the National Cyber Force, or NCF, which they established in 2020. They looked at the Title 1050 problem and decided to address it head-on through their organizational structure, defining the NCF as an integrated civil-military force.
Integrated civil military. So how does their internal structure actually manage to bridge that military and intelligence divide?
The NCF formally integrates personnel from the Ministry of Defense, which is the military side, GCHQ, which is the UK's Signals Intelligence and Cyber Organization, kind of analogous to the NSA, and MI6, their secret intelligence service. It puts them all into a single operational command structure.
So they're all on the same team?
Literally. Unlike the U.S., where the commander wears the dual hat, here, the operational units themselves are mixed. The teams are blended, and this is a powerful organizational fix. By having intelligence analysts and military planners literally sitting next to each other under the same NCF operational chief, they dramatically reduce the legal and bureaucratic friction for offensive cyber operations. Planning is streamlined because the military intent, the Title 10 equivalent, inherently incorporates the necessary intelligence support and technical access, the Title 50 equivalent, from the very outset. It's an elegant organizational shortcut that speeds up decision-making while still retaining the necessary high-level civilian oversight.
So the NCF is the UK's primary answer to that operational friction caused by the intelligence-military separation. Now let's turn to Australia. They offer a different but equally comprehensive solution, the Information Warfare Division, or IWD. And Australia's model is defined as the Holistic Domain Command approach. The IWD, established in 2018 within the Australian Defence Force, is a true organizational attempt to treat information as a single unified domain. It's similar to how the PLA conceptualizes it, but it's done within a strict democratic military framework.
That's right. The IWD consolidates cyber, electronic warfare, MISO, their influence operations, and strategic communications, all under one unified military command. This model is essentially aimed at solving the U.S. problem of organizational stovepipes. They explicitly centralized MISO and EW right alongside cyber. So the IWD commander has authority over the full spectrum of information capabilities. This allows them to mandate unified planning. So when they plan a network disruption using cyber, they automatically plan the corresponding electromagnetic suppression using EW and the simultaneous cognitive narrative using MISO and strategic comms, all under one roof. They completely avoid the U.S. necessity of coordinating across USOCOM, the Space Force, and the individual services just to launch a single combined information campaign.
It seems like this Australian model suggests that mid-sized democratic powers, especially those facing really urgent, immediate security concerns in their region, are willing to undertake far more radical organizational surgery than the larger, more entrenched U.S. system.
That is absolutely the interpretation the source material supports. Australia prioritized unified planning efficiency to compete effectively in its theater of operations, even if it meant overcoming traditional service or command boundaries much more quickly than its larger ally was willing to do.
And finally, we have to look at NATO. As a vast alliance of 32 sovereign nations, a unified command like the NCF or IWD is, well, it's politically impossible. So how do they manage information warfare?
NATO's model is one of necessity. It's coordination over command. Since it cannot command the sovereign national forces of its members, its focus is on building collective capacity, resilience, and interoperability. They rely heavily on shared doctrine and these specialized centers of excellence.
Like the ones in the Baltics?
Exactly. Institutions like the Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Riga, Latvia, and the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn, Estonia, they are vital. These centers develop shared training, they standardize doctrine, and they perform legal analysis to ensure that when 32 nations eventually act together, they are all operating from the same playbook. The key focus for NATO is what they call whole-of-society resilience. They recognize that the information domain cannot be defended by the military alone. It requires coordinating government agencies, private telecom sectors, the media, and civil society to defend against influence campaigns. And while it's slower than a centralized operational command, this approach reflects the political reality of an alliance, and it emphasizes building robust, society-wide defenses against continuous information assault.
Okay, let's unpack this central tension one last time, synthesizing what we've learned. On one side, we have the SSF model of extreme centralization. On the other, the Federated Western model, which is driven by specialized organizations and legal constraints. What are the high-level trade-offs here?
The trade-off is absolutely defined by the political system, and it comes down to this: centralization versus accountability. The PLA's SSF achieves unparalleled speed, doctrinal coherence, and unity of effort because it operates with virtually zero external accountability. They have fused intelligence collection, military action, and influence campaigns into one command structure, reporting to one political authority.
And the cost?
The cost is theater-level flexibility, since those strategic assets are centrally managed by the CMC and, of course, the total lack of democratic oversight. The Western models, the US, the UK, Australia, they sacrifice speed and unity of command to preserve specialized expertise, legal oversight, and fundamental democratic norms like civilian control and civil liberties. The organizational friction and the strategic latency we discussed, that's the necessary price you pay for transparency and accountability. You simply cannot run a presidential finding on a viral campaign and expect to win the speed competition.
And the distinction between how they leverage their national resources is equally dramatic. You mentioned China pursues civil-military fusion, which actively blurs those boundaries.
That's correct. China's civil military fusion, or CMF, is a mandatory national strategy. It seeks to eliminate the boundaries between the state, commercial technology companies, academia, and the PLA. This allows the SSF to rapidly leverage the nation's entire scientific and commercial resource base, all the technical talent, data streams, and platform capabilities for information operations. The entire nation becomes an asset pool for the centralized command.
And what does that look like in the democratic system? What's the contrast?
Well, democratic nations are legally mandated to maintain a strict protective separation between the military and intelligence sector and the civilian and commercial sector. We cannot, for instance, legally compel a company like Google or a telecom provider to share its data or deploy its talent for a specific military information operation. Therefore, democratic states have to rely on these complicated and difficult to coordinate whole of society or whole of government approaches. They have to rely on voluntary cooperation, public-private partnerships, and shared resilience strategies. This model is inherently slower and much more complex than simple centralized control. And that is a massive operational asymmetry. The PLA can command its national resources for information warfare. The U.S. and its allies have to ask politely and then navigate extensive legal frameworks to get help.
So if we look at the operational conclusion, how does this structural difference translate into a competitive advantage in the real world?
What the sources clearly indicate is this. The centralized SSF is optimally designed for sustained, rapid competition in the gray zone, operating below the threshold of armed conflict. In this environment, where speed and the synchronization of cyber, influence, and EW are paramount, the SSF's unified command structure gives the PLA the decisive advantage of initiative.
And the West.
Conversely, U.S. and allied forces, constrained by the necessary friction of civilian oversight and fragmentation, are fundamentally disadvantaged in this gray zone speed competition. And while they might possess superior technical capabilities in some areas, the inability to organize them coherently and quickly across the full spectrum of information effects means they continuously struggle with that strategic latency. They are effectively ceding the operational initiative.
So the ultimate challenge for democracies, as these models like the UK's NCF and Australia's IWD suggest, is undertaking organizational reform that's painful enough to allow them to compete effectively, but without compromising the very democratic norms and accountability standards that differentiate them from their authoritarian competitors. It's a strategic and really an existential tightrope walk.
It is the defining military organizational problem of our time. How do you build a system that's capable of viral speed while still requiring due process? The answer is proving to be elusive, and the competition is only accelerating. Hashtag Outerpay.
This has been an incredibly detailed deep dive into organizational warfare, and the core finding seems irrefutable. The structure a global power adopts for information warfare command is really a mirror of its underlying political system. Centralized authoritarian power mandates the SSF's unified high-speed military command. Democratic oversight and legal constraints mandate organizational fragmentation, complexity, and ultimately slower response times.
And the allied innovations we talked about show that integration isn't impossible, but they require genuine, painful organizational reform, a real willingness to confront entrenched legal and service-centric cultures. This suggests that the strategic competition in the information environment is, at its heart, a competition between organizational philosophies and the values they represent.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the learner. We established that the cognitive dimension, the minds of decision-makers and audiences, is arguably the most critical dimension of information warfare. It is also the dimension most heavily constrained by democratic norms and that legal separation, the Title 10 versus Title 50 divide, that limits how military and intelligence forces can conduct influence operations. So if democratic nations, due to these necessary constraints, cannot effectively integrate and command operations in this most critical, most sensitive dimension, how long can they truly maintain the information advantage they seek against adversaries who face no such ethical or legal constraints? It forces us to ask, is legal accountability in the information age a sustainable luxury? Something for you to consider as you navigate the constant flow of information and influence operations every single day.